The night settles softly over Sinaloa, the kind of night where every sound seems to float a little longer in the air, and every shadow carries a story. In that gentle quiet, there is a name whispered across decades, a name that once made powerful men sit straighter and cautious men lower their voices. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. To the world he would become El Padrino, the Godfather who united Mexico's most dangerous traffickers under a single, disciplined federation. But in these opening moments, as the world slows and the mind relaxes, his story begins not with violence or chaos, but with stillness, an echo of the calm presence he carried even at the height of his power. Imagine the vast landscape of northern Mexico under moonlight, long stretches of farmland, small houses scattered across valleys, roads that twist like old secrets through the mountains. It was in these lands, so often described only for their danger, that Felix Gallardo earned something far more unusual than fear. He earned trust. His criminal empire was not built on loud threats or reckless brutality. It was structured through patience, negotiation, and a kind of cold, quiet intelligence that rarely drew attention. While other traffickers fought openly, leaving scars on the land and on their reputations, Gallardo moved softly. He watched. He listened. He waited for the perfect moment to create something no one had imagined before. Tonight, as you listen, let your mind drift back to a time before his rise, when Mexico's drug trade was wild and unorganized, scattered among small groups ruled by unpredictable gunmen. Each group fought its own battles, protected its own routes, and trusted no one beyond a small circle. Violence flared across the countryside without warning, and the authorities, some corrupt, some simply overwhelmed, struggled to understand how the pieces even fit together. It was a world without structure, a world that seemed impossible for any one man to control. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, there was Felix. A man who didn't resemble the typical image of a cartel leader. He was educated, well-spoken, always careful with his words. Those who met him described him as polite, composed, even charming. He didn't drink much, didn't lose his temper, didn't flaunt money the way others did. He preferred suits over flashy outfits, quiet conversations over crowded parties. He learned early that power was not always loud. Sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one who barely speaks. As his influence grew, so did the legend. People began to say he could talk two enemies into becoming business partners. They whispered that he had connections in places others wouldn't dare approach. They said he understood the future of the drug trade long before anyone realized how big it would become. Yet even as they spoke his name, many had never seen him. He avoided cameras, avoided unnecessary attention, avoided the spotlight that so many criminals chased. His power came from the shadows, from the networks he built, from the alliances he wove together with a patient hand. But before all of that, before the wealth, before the political protection, before the collapse and the prison years, there was just a young man walking the quiet roads of Sinaloa, watching the world around him. The mountains held stories of old traffickers and smuggling routes carved through the wilderness. The villages lived under an unspoken rule, that survival required understanding both the law and those who lived outside it. From a young age, Gallardo learned how to navigate those two worlds. Not with violence, but with observation. Not with fear, but with strategy. What makes his story so compelling is not just what he did, but how he did it. Many criminals rise through brutality. Many force their way into power. But Gallardo built an empire the way a chess player wins a match, not by overpowering the board, but by outthinking it. As you follow his journey tonight, you'll see the way each move led to another, how small decisions shaped massive outcomes, and how one quiet man became the architect of the Mexican drug trade as the world knows it today. There is calmness in returning to the beginning of a story, especially one filled with such heavy history. The early years feel distant, softened by time, like memories fading at the edges. You can picture the soft rustle of crops in the night wind, the glow of lanterns outside modest homes, the distant hum of life in rural Mexico. Somewhere in that landscape, a young Felix observed everything, the corruption woven into institutions, the opportunities hidden behind official titles, the ambitions of local traffickers who dreamed of more than small-town smuggling. He must have known, even then, that the world around him was unbalanced, stretched thin between poverty and opportunity, law and crime, hope and resignation. He must have felt the pull of something larger than the life he was expected to live. And yet, nothing about his early demeanor suggested the creation of a legend. He seemed almost invisible, a man who blended into the background, a man who nodded politely, spoke carefully, and revealed very little of what he was truly thinking. But deep inside, the pieces were forming. A vision was taking shape, a vision of a drug world organized not through fear alone, but through structure. A federation where profits were shared, routes were respected, and chaos was replaced by order. It was the kind of idea that required a mastermind. And in the stillness of those early years, Gallardo slowly became that mastermind. As the night wraps around you, let this opening chapter settle softly. A quiet beginning for a man who would eventually control routes stretching from the mountains of Mexico to the cities of the United States, a man whose decisions would change the course of criminal history. His story is not one of noise, but of silence. Not one of reckless ambition, but of deliberate, calculated movement. And beneath it all, the lingering question remains, how did such a quiet man become the godfather who united Mexico's cartels? The answer unfolds slowly, layer by layer, just as the night deepens outside your window. The mountains of Sinaloa rise like ancient guardians, their silhouettes softened under the early morning haze. In these rugged landscapes, where the earth is dry and the sun casts long patient shadows, the childhood of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo quietly unfolded. Long before he would become a name spoken in whispers, he was simply a boy shaped by the land, by the rhythm of farm life, by the slow pulse of a region caught between tradition and survival. Here, in the small town of Bella Vista, life moved at a gentler pace, and each day carried the same familiar sounds, roosters calling at dawn, footsteps on dirt roads, conversations drifting through open doorways, and the wind rustling through fields that had fed generations. For a young boy, these surroundings were both comforting and revealing. Sinaloa was a place where poverty lived side by side with resilience. Families worked endlessly to keep food on the table, sharing whatever little they had with neighbors who struggled even more. Children grew up fast, learning early what was expected of them, yet they still found time to run barefoot through the orchards, to laugh under the shade of large mango trees, to kick dusty soccer balls until the sun dipped behind the mountains. These small, simple joys formed the foundation of Gallardo's early memories. He was raised not in luxury, but in a world where every grain of effort mattered. Yet even this peaceful landscape carried darker undertones. Sinaloa had long been the cradle of Mexico's illicit crop cultivation. Opium poppies hid in remote hills, tended by farmers whose ancestors had passed down both seeds and survival strategies. Marijuana plantations blended with legal fields, and everyone, children included, knew which paths to avoid, which strangers not to speak to, which topics adults discussed only behind closed doors. Crime wasn't an outside force here. It was part of the environment, woven into the daily struggles of people trying to escape hunger and debt. In this complex world, young Felix absorbed everything quietly. Family members described him as observant, serious, and perceptive, a child who listened more than he spoke. He noticed the way adults tensed when certain names were mentioned, the way conversations stopped abruptly when law enforcement appeared, the way people with money carried themselves differently from those who had nothing. These early observations planted seeds of understanding. He learned that power came in many forms, the power of respect, the power of knowledge, and the power of silence. School offered him a different kind of escape. Unlike many children who left classrooms early to work in the fields, Gallardo excelled academically. Teachers described him as disciplined and curious, someone who approached learning with genuine interest. He didn't act like a typical child of the countryside. There was a calm maturity in him, a sense that his ambitions were quietly stretching beyond the limits of his environment. While other boys dreamed of becoming ranchers or soldiers, Felix began to envision a life that offered more control, more stability, more influence. The contrast between his gentle upbringing and the harsh realities around him was stark. On one side, he experienced the warmth of community, shared meals, family gatherings, stories passed from generation to generation. On the other, he witnessed inequality, corruption, and the unspoken power held by men who operated outside the law. These dual realities shaped his mindset before he even understood their full implications. He learned that survival required adaptability. He learned that strength wasn't always physical, it was the ability to read people, to understand motives, to anticipate outcomes. Even as a young boy, he displayed a level of emotional intelligence far beyond his years. Evenings in Bella Vista brought a calmness that masked the struggles of the day. After the heat faded, families would sit outside their homes, sipping coffee or sweet drinks, exchanging quiet conversations while children played nearby. The crickets hummed, the stars emerged in waves, and the air cooled with the scent of soil and vegetation. In these peaceful moments, Felix often sat quietly beside older relatives, absorbing stories of the past, tales of hardship, migration, and the region's long history with farming both legal and illicit. Some of these stories spoke of traffickers who had found fortune smuggling products across borders. These men were often viewed with a mixture of fear and admiration. They were dangerous, but they were also symbols of what hunger and ambition could create. They moved silently, made decisions with confidence, and commanded a certain magnetic respect from the community. These impressions settled in the young boy's mind, not as inspiration, but as knowledge, another piece of the world he was trying to understand. His family taught him values, respect, hard work, humility. But the land around him taught him something else entirely, the art of survival. Every day was a lesson. He saw how quickly people fell when they miscalculated trust. He witnessed how certain men thrived not through force, but through organization and relationships. He learned that influence could be built quietly, that true power did not always announce itself. By the time he reached adolescence, Gallardo was already different from many of his peers. He carried himself with an unusual calm confidence, someone who understood the importance of both appearance and restraint. He knew when to speak and when to stay silent. He understood that the world rewarded those who paid attention. Without realizing it, he was developing the very qualities that would later define his rise: patience, discipline, strategic observation, and the ability to move unnoticed. Life in Sinaloa continued to shape him as he stepped into adulthood. The mountains remained constant, the heat remained unforgiving, and the same unspoken rules governed the region. But inside Felix, something had begun to grow, an awareness that he could navigate both the respectable world and the criminal world with equal ease. The boy who once watched from the sidelines would soon step into roles that placed him directly at the crossroads of law and corruption. In these early years, nothing yet pointed explicitly toward the empire he would one day build. He was simply a young man molded by his environment, an environment where opportunities were limited, but ambition could transform a quiet boy into a figure of unimaginable influence. The roots of his life were planted in dusty soil, but they would grow far beyond Bella Vista, stretching into the highest levels of organized crime. And so, the story of Felix Gallardo's rise begins not with power, but with place. With the mountains, the poverty, the close-knit communities, and the silent lessons taught by the land that raised him. A soft beginning for a future godfather, one shaped as much by circumstance as by choice, one who walked his early years in shadows that would eventually become his home. The transition from boyhood to early adulthood is often quiet, almost unnoticeable, like a subtle shift in the wind that only reveals itself in hindsight. For Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, this shift came with a growing awareness that the world around him was larger than Bella Vista, larger than the farms, larger even than the unspoken networks of cultivation and smuggling woven through Sinaloa's hills. As he entered his late teens and early 20s, he carried with him the same composed demeanor that had marked his childhood, observant, thoughtful, and quietly ambitious. But now that ambition had room to grow. He was no longer just a boy listening to stories under the stars. He was a young man searching for his place in a world where opportunity often lived in the shadows. Unlike many from his region, Gallardo didn't immediately turn to illicit work. Instead, he pursued education seriously. He studied business and eventually stepped into public service, a path that seemed noble on the surface but was deeply entangled with the corruption that ran through many Mexican institutions. His entry into the state police force marked the beginning of a journey that would bring him into direct contact with the dual faces of authority, the official rules written in procedure manuals, and the unwritten ones whispered quietly between powerful men. As a young officer, Gallardo quickly stood out. He wasn't aggressive, nor did he try to display dominance. Instead, he exuded something far more valuable: calm confidence. He spoke politely, stood with discipline, and managed to calm tensions with just a few carefully chosen words. Superiors took note. They saw someone they could trust, someone who followed orders without drawing attention, someone who understood discretion. In a landscape where many officers were brash and unpredictable, Gallardo's consistency made him an asset. This period of his life introduced him to something he had never experienced in Bella Vista: the inner workings of political influence. The police force wasn't just a place for law enforcement, it was a hub where connections were forged, allegiances were traded, and information moved quietly between those who needed to stay ahead. Felix witnessed how certain individuals navigated these relationships with ease, leveraging them for personal gain. And again, he watched in silence, absorbing every detail, learning which alliances mattered and which could crumble. His work as a police officer eventually led him into a more delicate role: bodyguard to Leopoldo Sanchez Silas, the governor of Sinaloa. This position changed everything. Serving under a high-ranking official gave Gallardo access to powerful circles where business, politics, and the criminal underworld overlapped in ways few outsiders ever understood. He learned how deals were made behind closed doors, how favors were exchanged, how certain names were protected at all costs. He saw how influence could be more effective than force, how a carefully timed agreement could achieve more than 100 gunmen. Gallardo was not merely observing anymore, he was participating. Quietly, subtly, but undeniably participating. His ability to remain composed even in tense situations made him a trusted presence. The governor valued him. Politicians respected him. Even individuals with questionable reputations recognized his potential. He had become someone who could be relied upon to pass messages, to arrange meetings, to keep sensitive information safe. This blending of the legitimate and the illicit did not create a moral conflict for him. In Sinaloa, such overlap was normal. But Gallardo was different in how he navigated it. He didn't act out of impulse or greed. His choices were deliberate, measured. While many were tempted by quick money or flashy displays of power, he remained disciplined. He dressed neatly, avoided unnecessary luxuries, and never bragged. His ambition didn't need noise. It needed opportunity. And opportunity, in those years, arrived through the introduction of names that would shape the future of the Mexican drug trade. Figures who operated quietly in the background, traffickers who had grown out of the older generations and were now searching for new ways to structure their operations. People began approaching Gallardo not because he was corrupt, but because he was trustworthy. He understood discretion. He understood loyalty. And most importantly, he understood strategy. Even before he met the men who would become his partners, Gallardo sensed the direction the world was moving. The United States' appetite for drugs was growing, and so was the revenue drifting south across the border. The demand for organization, real, structured organization, was becoming clear. The scattered groups in Sinaloa lacked the leadership required to turn small operations into something bigger. They had courage, but not coordination. They had routes, but not strategy. Gallardo saw the gaps, and quietly, the idea of filling them began to take shape in his mind. During these years, his personality continued to evolve. He became more patient, more analytical. He learned how to read expressions during negotiations, how to detect lies hidden in polite words, how to gauge loyalty not by promises but by actions. His understanding of human nature deepened. He learned that fear created obedience, but respect created longevity. He chose the latter. His growing network wasn't built through intimidation. It was built through relationships with politicians, soldiers, businessmen, and influential families. Each connection was a piece of a puzzle he was slowly assembling, even if he didn't yet know what the completed picture would look like. Despite his quiet rise, he remained cautious. He avoided unnecessary risks, choosing instead to strengthen alliances and observe the moves of others. This careful approach allowed him to develop something rare: credibility in both the legal and illegal worlds. He could sit in a government office in the morning and walk through a ranch with traffickers in the evening, moving seamlessly between environments that normally existed in tension with each other. By the time Gallardo reached his mid-20s, he had become a man with one foot planted firmly in respectability and the other stepping deeper into the shadows. His intelligence, discipline, and natural diplomacy made him both an asset and a potential leader, someone capable of guiding others out of chaos and into organization. It was here, in this transition period, where his destiny began to crystallize. He wasn't just watching the world anymore. He was preparing to influence it. The young man who once walked the dusty paths of Sinaloa with curiosity now walked them with purpose. The quiet observer had become a strategist, and the foundation of the future Guadalajara cartel was forming beneath his feet, even if the world had not yet noticed. His rise had begun, not with violence or ambition, but with discipline, intelligence, and a growing understanding of the systems that surrounded him. Each lesson, each connection, each silent observation was pushing him toward a path that would reshape Mexico's criminal landscape forever. The meeting between Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and Pedro Avilés Pérez did not happen in a moment of thunder or drama. It happened slowly, almost silently, as all significant turning points in Gallardo's life seemed to. At the time, Pedro Avilés, known throughout Sinaloa and beyond as El León de la Sierra, the Lion of the Mountains, was already a legendary figure. He was among the first major traffickers to move drugs on a scale the government could no longer ignore. Avilés operated with a rugged charisma, a kind of confidence born from surviving gunfights, betrayals, and the wilderness itself. He was everything the older generation of Sinaloan traffickers admired: bold, intimidating, fiercely loyal to his own, and utterly unafraid of confrontation. But it was precisely because Avilés was larger than life that he needed someone like Felix Gallardo. A strategist. A thinker. A man who didn't need to brandish weapons or raise his voice to command attention. Their worlds collided at a time when the drug trade was evolving, shifting from small operations to something far more complex, a business that required brains as much as brutality. And in this intersection, Avilés saw potential in the quiet young man who carried himself with eerie composure. Their introduction was facilitated by mutual acquaintances, men involved in smuggling, men who had noticed the rising presence of Felix and understood that his unique combination of intelligence, discipline, and trustworthiness could serve the organization well. When Gallardo first met Avilés, it wasn't with the intention of becoming a criminal. He approached the encounter with the same calm professionalism he brought to his role in law enforcement and to his work as a bodyguard. But something about Avilés' influence, his reputation, his authority, his confidence, left a powerful impression. The first time Gallardo visited the mountain ranch where Avilés operated, the air was thick with the scent of pine and dust. Men with rifles stood at the perimeter, the kind of guards who didn't bother hiding their suspicion. Horses flicked their tails, chickens scattered underfoot, and the distant noise of a generator hummed like a heartbeat beneath the operations being carried out. The ranch was both a sanctuary and a fortress, a place where Avilés commanded respect with nothing more than his presence. Gallardo observed everything. The way workers hurried to complete tasks. The way lieutenants approached Avilés with updates. The way business decisions were made on instinct and impulse, not strategy. He recognized immediately that while Avilés was powerful, he was vulnerable. His methods were outdated. His network, though loyal, lacked the sophistication necessary to survive in a world that was becoming increasingly interconnected. The enemy wasn't just the police anymore, it was changing markets, unreliable alliances, and the emerging presence of U.S. law enforcement. But despite the chaotic environment, there was something captivating about the man at the center of it all. Aviles had a magnetism that drew people in. He was fearless, direct, and charismatic. He trusted his instincts, and more importantly, he valued courage. He appreciated men who didn't flinch, men who remained steady under pressure. And when he looked at Gallardo, he saw something unusual, a calmness that couldn't be shaken. It didn't take long for Aviles to test him. He gave him small responsibilities first, delivering messages, organizing schedules, advising on movement routes. Gallardo handled each task with precision, never revealing stress, never making mistakes. He quickly proved himself as someone who could be relied upon in delicate situations. While other men in the organization acted impulsively or sought glory, Gallardo remained steady, almost invisible, yet undeniably effective. In return, Aviles became an unintentional mentor. Gallardo learned from him not just how the business worked, but how the older generation thought. He learned about risk, loyalty, hierarchy, and the importance of understanding every link in a supply chain. He also learned the value, and the cost, of leadership. Aviles' life was a constant balancing act, settling disputes, rewarding loyalty, punishing betrayal, all while keeping the operation running smoothly. But Gallardo also noticed Aviles' flaws. He saw the unnecessary violence, the random decisions, the lack of long-term planning. He observed how Aviles' pride often put him in danger, how grudges led to conflict, and how ego clouded judgment. Gallardo, even in his early years, knew that such a model could not last forever. He understood that true power came not from instilling fear through gunfire, but from creating stability and predictability, two things the drug trade had never known. During long nights in the Sierra Madre, Gallardo would stay awake, listening to the faint murmur of voices outside. He would analyze every conversation, every decision, every alliance. The wilderness around him felt ancient, filled with secrets. Under the blanket of stars, he learned to think several steps ahead, to anticipate problems before they appeared, to understand what Aviles could not, that the future of the trade would require organization, not chaos. Despite their differences, the bond between the two men grew. Aviles respected Gallardo's intelligence and saw him as a stabilizing force. Gallardo, in turn, respected Aviles' courage and charisma, even if he didn't agree with his methods. The relationship was not that of father and son, nor strictly of boss and subordinate, it was something more strategic. They needed each other, even if they didn't fully realize it at the time. Gallardo's reputation began to spread quietly. Those in the circle of Aviles noticed how efficiently he handled problems, how he diffused tensions, how he maintained peace among volatile personalities. He never boasted, never overstepped, but slowly people began to turn to him for guidance. His name became associated with reliability, a rare trait in a world fueled by greed and unpredictability. This period also revealed something deeper about Gallardo, his ability to separate emotion from decision-making. While Aviles acted with passion, Gallardo acted with calculation. He watched how anger, revenge, and pride clouded judgment, leading to unnecessary bloodshed. He vowed, silently, that he would operate differently when his time came. And all the while, he noticed the cracks forming around his mentor. Aviles was aging, taking more risks, trusting the wrong people. His leadership style, once effective, was becoming outdated in a rapidly evolving drug market. Gallardo saw the writing on the wall long before anyone else did. He knew that the era of the old-style trafficker was coming to an end, and that someone would eventually need to bring order to the chaos that would follow. That someone, he realized, could be him. But he did not seek to overthrow Aviles. He was too disciplined for that. Instead, he observed quietly, waiting for the inevitable shift. And when that shift came, when the mentor's empire began to shake, it would be Gallardo who stepped forward, not with force, but with strategy, ready to build something the world had never seen before. The seeds of the Guadalajara cartel, the federation that would unite Mexico's traffickers under one structured umbrella, were planted here, in the mountains, in the mentorship of a man who ruled with instinct, and in the mind of a young strategist who learned to rule with intellect. The end of Pedro Aviles Perez's reign didn't arrive with the elegance of a slow sunset. It came suddenly, brutally, like a storm collapsing without warning. And for Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the death of his mentor was not just the conclusion of one man's life, it was the opening of an entire era, a throne left empty in a landscape where power never stayed unclaimed for long. The year was 1978. By then, the Mexican drug trade was shifting rapidly. U.S. pressure was increasing, Colombian suppliers were expanding, and local smuggling groups were becoming bolder. Yet despite all these changes, Aviles remained loyal to his old ways, direct confrontations, risky transports, and decisions made in the heat of the moment. He was respected for his courage, but courage alone could not hold together the growing cracks in his organization. Rumors had been building for weeks. Talk of betrayal. Talk of the authorities knowing too much. Talk of alliances fraying at the edges. Gallardo, with his natural instinct for reading situations, sensed danger approaching long before anyone said it aloud. He noticed the tension in conversations, the nervous glances exchanged between men, the sudden silence when certain names were mentioned. Something was shifting in the mountains of Sinaloa. Yet even he didn't expect how quickly it would all fall apart. The ambush happened on a dusty road, the type that wound through countryside too remote for most people to ever visit. Aviles was traveling in one of his trucks, accompanied by a small group of loyalists. The air was thick with heat, the sky painfully bright. The terrain was open, too open. It was the kind of road where escape was nearly impossible if trouble appeared. Gallardo wasn't present, but the accounts he later heard painted a clear picture. The gunshots erupted without warning. High-powered rifles cracked through the stillness, echoing off distant hillsides. The ambush was efficient, ruthless. Aviles' men barely had time to react. Tires screeched. Dust exploded into the air. Men shouted. Bullets tore through metal and flesh alike. And within minutes, the man who had once dominated Sinaloa's drug routes lay slumped in a vehicle, mortally wounded. Some claimed it was the Mexican Federal Police. Others whispered it was a betrayal orchestrated from within. Still others insisted it had been engineered by rising traffickers eager to remove a man whose methods no longer served the evolving market. In truth, no one ever confirmed the exact origin of the attack. What mattered was the result. The Lion of the Mountains was gone, and his organization shattered instantly. When news reached Gallardo, he did not react with emotion. There were no outbursts, no vows of revenge, no displays of grief. He simply listened, processed the details, and allowed the quiet truth to settle into his mind. Aviles, for all his strength and influence, had been operating on borrowed time. His leadership had become too exposed, too vulnerable. His reliance on force instead of strategy had marked him as a target. And now that target had been erased. What remained behind was chaos. With the death of Aviles, his network splintered overnight. Lieutenants turned on each other. Routes were abandoned or seized by rival groups. Stashes disappeared. Former allies scrambled to distance themselves from the operation, fearing that federal agents would soon come after them. Violence erupted across the region as smaller factions attempted to claim whatever they could before someone else took it. The organization that had once seemed powerful and unified dissolved into scattered pieces almost instantly, like fragile pottery shattering on the ground. In the midst of this turmoil, Gallardo stood firm. Unlike others, he wasn't panicking or fighting over scraps. He saw something that the others could not: opportunity. Not in a predatory way, but in a strategic one. He recognized that the chaos created by Aviles' death was a void, one that someone would eventually fill. He also understood that whoever stepped forward next could not operate the way Aviles had. The new era required structure, negotiation, and oversight. It required a leader who could do more than intimidate. It required someone who could unify. People began turning to him almost naturally. They sought him out for advice, for clarity, for direction. His reputation for intelligence and calm leadership had grown quietly under Aviles, and now it became a lifeline for those desperate for stability. He was not the richest, nor the most violent, nor the most charismatic. But he was the most reliable, the most composed, the most strategic. He was the one who could think beyond immediate survival. In meetings held in remote ranches and quiet safe houses, men argued, threatened, negotiated. Many wanted to claim leadership, but they lacked Gallardo's vision. They were still thinking in small terms, about fields, shipments, and individual routes. Gallardo, meanwhile, was thinking about the entire region. He understood that fragmentation would destroy them. That a war over territory would weaken everyone. That the only way forward was unity. But unity required a leader capable of forming alliances with the most unpredictable men in Sinaloa. A leader who, unlike Aviles, didn't depend on dominance to earn loyalty. Someone who could persuade instead of intimidate. Someone who could bring together the older traffickers of the Sierra and the ambitious upstarts rising from Culiacan. And so, step by quiet step, Gallardo positioned himself as that leader. His rise was not dramatic. It didn't involve a bloodbath or a grand announcement. Instead, his ascent happened in the same manner he lived his early adulthood, calmly, strategically, almost invisibly. He listened more than he spoke. He offered solutions instead of threats. He built small alliances, one conversation at a time, until those alliances formed a structure stronger than anything Aviles had ever built. The fall of Aviles marked the end of an era defined by improvisation and impulse. But it also marked the beginning of something unprecedented. In the vacuum left behind, Gallardo stepped forward, not as a warlord, not as a showman, but as an organizer. A coordinator. A man with a vision that stretched far beyond the rugged mountains where he had quietly learned the trade. The story of his true rise begins here, in the aftermath of a mentor's violent end. In the silence that followed the gunfire. In the questions left unanswered. And in the realization that the world of drug trafficking was ready for a new kind of leader, one shaped not by force, but by foresight. The years that followed the death of Pedro Aviles were marked by a kind of restless uncertainty throughout Sinaloa. Traffickers who once relied on Aviles' authority were now without direction. Some attempted to claim power for themselves, others retreated to protect what little control they had left, and many waited quietly to see who would emerge as the region's next guiding force. In this fragile environment, the drug trade risked collapsing into endless feuds, wars over territory, connections, and shipments that could drain profits and attract the kind of attention no trafficker wanted. But in the middle of this chaos stood a man who never lost his composure. Felix Gallardo watched the shifting alliances, listened to conversations filled with fear and uncertainty, and recognized that what Sinaloa needed most wasn't strength, it was structure. He understood that the future wouldn't belong to the boldest or the most violent. It would belong to the man who could bring order where others saw only disorder. And slowly, methodically, he began planting the seeds of something unprecedented. The idea was simple in concept but revolutionary in execution, a federation. Not a single boss commanding everyone through fear, but a council of major traffickers working together, each overseeing their own regions while cooperating under a shared umbrella. Instead of competing against one another, they would coordinate. Instead of fighting for routes, they would share them. Instead of risking their lives in turf wars, they would unite against common threats, rival groups, unpredictable suppliers, and increasingly aggressive U.S. agencies. This vision could never be achieved through force. It required negotiation, diplomacy, and someone capable of sitting at a table with dangerous men and convincing them that peace, not war, would be the foundation of their future. Felix had all the qualities needed for such a task: patience, intelligence, restraint, and a natural ability to read people. He also had connections, political ones he forged during his time in law enforcement and while working as a bodyguard for high-ranking officials. Those connections weren't weapons, but leverage, a promise of protection and stability that many traffickers desperately needed. To build the Federation, he had to choose allies carefully. The first key figure was Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, better known as Don Neto. A trafficker from a different generation, Don Neto possessed experience, connections, and a calm, almost fatherly presence. He understood the business deeply and recognized early on that Gallardo was not just another ambitious young man. He saw a strategist, someone who could build an organization that would outlast impulsive rivals. Then there was Rafael Caro Quintero, young, bold, wildly ambitious, and already making waves for his expertise in large-scale marijuana cultivation. Caro Quintero was impulsive where Gallardo was disciplined, aggressive where Gallardo was patient, but his talent was undeniable. His plantations were massive, sophisticated, and profitable, capable of producing quantities that shocked even older traffickers. Gallardo recognized that Caro's enthusiasm and daring nature could fuel the Federation's growth, provided his impulses were guided by a steadier hand. These three men formed the nucleus of what would become the Guadalajara Cartel. But uniting them was only the first step. The real challenge lay in convincing dozens of independent traffickers, each with their own pride, fears, and ambitions, to come together under a shared structure. It required delicate negotiation, careful planning, and a vision compelling enough to outweigh decades of rivalry. Gallardo approached each group with the same calm professionalism that had always defined him. He explained that competition was costing them money, attracting the wrong kind of attention, and weakening their influence. He presented charts, maps, and numbers, methods previously unheard of in the drug world. He used logic, not fear. Stability, not dominance. He spoke of routes that could be protected collectively. Profits that could be shared fairly. Political connections that could be leveraged for everyone, not just a select few. Slowly, the traffickers began to see the sense in his plan. Meetings took place in ranches, safe houses, and discreet hotels. Men who once refused to speak to each other now sat across the same table, listening as Gallardo outlined how unity could change everything. And in those meetings, the Federation took shape, first in principles, then in agreements, and finally in practice. When the Guadalajara Cartel was officially formed, it didn't resemble anything Mexico had seen before. It was a corporation masquerading as a criminal organization. It had structure, rules, and a hierarchy. Caro Quintero managed cultivation. Don Neto oversaw logistics and training. Gallardo supervised relationships, financial operations, and strategic planning. Territory disputes were settled diplomatically, often with Gallardo mediating patiently, offering compromises that allowed everyone to walk away satisfied. With the Federation united, conflict dropped dramatically. Violence decreased. Profits soared. The cartel's operations grew efficient, almost businesslike. Rather than dozens of small groups fighting for survival, the Guadalajara Cartel became one powerful entity capable of working with Colombian suppliers, bribing high-level officials, and transporting massive shipments with shocking efficiency. The organization's reach expanded beyond Sinaloa into Jalisco, Chihuahua, Sonora, and Baja California. Airstrips were built. Warehouses were established. Smuggling routes were mapped and fortified. It was no longer about surviving, it was about thriving. Expanding and adapting to a rapidly growing market. Behind all of this was Gallardo, quiet, composed, always thinking 3 steps ahead. He attended meetings in crisp suits, carrying himself more like a diplomat than a trafficker. While others celebrated wealth through parties, luxury cars, and extravagant homes, Gallardo remained understated. His true satisfaction came from seeing his vision unfold exactly as he had imagined. But even as the cartel flourished, he knew something crucial: unity was fragile. It required constant maintenance, constant negotiation, constant vigilance. He was building something powerful, yes, but also something that could crumble as quickly as the old network had under Aviles if egos, violence, or greed spiraled out of control. Still, in these early days, the Guadalajara cartel felt unstoppable. Routes were secure, profits were unprecedented, and political protection was extensive. For the first time in Mexico's criminal history, a complete federation existed, one that controlled cultivation, transportation, distribution, and international partnerships. And it all began with a vision born from chaos, shaped by patience, and fueled by alliances that few believed could ever exist. The cartel was not built on fear, but on structure. Not on violence, but on strategy. And as Gallardo watched the pieces fall into place, he understood the truth: the world had entered a new era, an era he had quietly crafted with his own hands. In the early 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel was no longer a loose alliance of traffickers, it was a rapidly expanding machine. A machine built on organization, discipline, and a level of coordination that had never existed in Mexico's underworld. And at the center of that machine stood Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, whose calm intelligence guided every major decision. While others operated with impulsive force, Gallardo relied on innovation, negotiation, and a quiet kind of influence that reached deeper than violence ever could. The cartel's rise during this period was not accidental. It was crafted through a series of deliberate decisions, each one calculated, each one reinforcing the authority of the federation Gallardo had built. He saw the drug trade as a business, not a battlefield. He believed that order was the key to longevity, and he worked tirelessly to establish systems that would protect the organization from the internal conflicts and external threats that had destroyed so many before them. One of Gallardo's most significant innovations was his restructuring of trafficking routes. For decades, smugglers had relied on simple, often reckless methods, crossing the border through isolated desert paths or using small makeshift landing strips that could be compromised at any moment. These routes worked, but they were inefficient and carried enormous risks. Gallardo understood that if the cartel was going to operate on a truly international scale, they needed something better. He began by organizing a complex network of corridors that ran from the interior of Mexico to strategic border points. These corridors were monitored carefully, secured by corrupt law enforcement officials, and designed to minimize exposure. Each route had a designated overseer, responsible for its maintenance, security, and secrecy. On the surface, these routes seemed simple, but behind them was a sophisticated system of communication, bribes, safe houses, and checkpoints that allowed massive quantities of narcotics to move quietly across the country. Gallardo also modernized transportation methods. The cartel acquired private jets, trained pilots, built hidden airstrips, and established coded radio channels that connected teams across vast distances. They used fishing boats disguised as ordinary vessels, trucks modified with hidden compartments, and convoys coordinated with military-like precision. Every movement was tracked, timed, and executed with careful attention, reducing the kind of chaos that once defined smuggling operations. But perhaps the biggest innovation came through Gallardo's diplomatic approach. He understood that corruption was not just a tool, it was a shield. Through his political connections, he formed relationships with high-ranking officials, military commanders, police leaders, and wealthy businessmen. These weren't transactional bribes that ended after a single favor. These were cultivated relationships, nurtured slowly and maintained with consistency. Gallardo offered loyalty, reliability, and predictable cooperation, qualities that earned him trust from people who normally distrusted criminals. He made sure officials were treated with respect, paid generously, and never placed in unnecessary danger. In return, the cartel received advance warnings of raids, safe passage along certain routes, and protection from investigations that might have threatened their operations. This network of influence became one of the cartel's greatest strengths, a quiet armor that allowed them to operate almost openly without suffering consequences. Under Gallardo's guidance, the cartel expanded its operations beyond marijuana, tapping into the booming cocaine market through partnerships with Colombian suppliers. It was here that his strategic brilliance shined brightest. Colombians needed reliable transport routes to reach the United States. Mexican traffickers needed the lucrative profits cocaine offered. Gallardo recognized the perfect symmetry between these needs. Instead of forcing alliances through intimidation, he approached Colombian cartels, particularly those connected to the Medellin organization, with the calm professionalism of a businessman. He offered something no one else in Mexico could: efficiency, reliability, and unified control over a massive network of smuggling routes. The Colombians were impressed not by displays of power, but by Gallardo's meticulous planning, his respectful demeanor, and his willingness to honor agreements without unnecessary demands. These partnerships transformed the Guadalajara cartel into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. Shipments increased dramatically. Profits soared to levels unimaginable just a few years earlier. Money flowed through Mexico in rivers, filling ranches, businesses, political campaigns, and entire sectors of the economy. The scale of the operation became so vast that even banks quietly welcomed the deposits, asking few questions, eager to benefit from the influx of cash. But as the cartel grew, its internal structure evolved to match its expanding reach. Gallardo implemented a system of delegated authority. Each lieutenant oversaw a region or operation, reporting directly to him. Caro Quintero managed cultivation and oversaw massive plantations like Rancho Buffalo. Don Neto supervised training, logistics, and the coordination of shipments. Others were assigned to surveillance, bribe distribution, or financial management. The structure resembled a corporation more than a gang, complete with specialized departments, leaders, and protocols. Gallardo's role, however, remained unique. He was the silent architect, the negotiator, the one who kept egos balanced and conflicts contained. When tensions rose between different factions, he intervened calmly, offering compromises that prevented bloodshed. When a route became compromised, he quickly redirected operations to minimize losses. His ability to anticipate problems and create solutions before others even recognized the issues became legendary among his associates. Yet, through all of this growth, he maintained the same quiet demeanor that had set him apart from the beginning. He avoided flamboyant displays of wealth. He didn't surround himself with armed men for show. He didn't attend extravagant parties or boast about his influence. Instead, he continued to operate from the shadows, letting others draw attention while he directed the organization with a steady, unseen hand. This invisibility became one of his greatest strengths. While figures like Pablo Escobar dominated headlines and attracted global attention, Gallardo kept a low profile, blending into the background and avoiding the spotlight. His approach allowed the Guadalajara cartel to grow without triggering the kind of international pressure that had crippled other organizations. But with growth came new challenges. The more the cartel expanded, the more it relied on a delicate balance of loyalty, fear, and financial incentive. Rivals watched the organization with envy. Corrupt officials became more demanding. And within the cartel itself, personalities like Caro Quintero, brilliant but impulsive, began to strain against the structure Gallardo had carefully built. Still, during this golden period, the cartel operated with efficiency previously unimaginable. Mexico's drug trade had gone from scattered operations to a coordinated empire, largely because Gallardo recognized what others had ignored, that power was not in force alone, but in organization, innovation, and subtlety. The golden routes had been built. The political protection had been secured. The partnerships had been formed. And for a time, it seemed as though the Guadalajara cartel would continue to rise indefinitely, guided by the quiet mastermind who had turned chaos into a system. But systems, especially those built on illegal foundations, are fragile. And the cracks, though still small, had already begun forming beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when they would widen into fractures that no organization, no matter how well constructed, could survive. The Guadalajara cartel's power did not rely solely on cultivation, transportation, or even its immense profits. Its true strength lay in something far more subtle, far more enduring, and far more dangerous than any weapon or shipment. It lay in the invisible network that Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo quietly wove through every corner of Mexico's political and security landscape. This network, delicate in appearance but formidable in function, became the backbone of the cartel's supremacy. And it was built not with threats or intimidation, but with diplomacy, patience, and the kind of strategic foresight few traffickers possessed. To understand Gallardo's influence, one must understand the Mexico of the early 1980s. It was a country governed by a single powerful political party, where loyalty flowed downward and favors traveled upward, creating a tightly knit hierarchy of influence. Decisions were made behind closed doors, often over drinks or quiet dinners. Officials understood that power depended not on public image, but on maintaining relationships with the right allies. Corruption existed not as an exception, but as an unspoken system, a parallel structure functioning beneath the official one. Gallardo recognized this world intimately. His years as a police officer and bodyguard had taught him how the machinery of politics truly operated. He understood who held influence, who owed favors, who had ambitions that could be quietly supported in exchange for loyalty. And he used this knowledge with surgical precision. Unlike other traffickers who flaunted wealth or used bribery bluntly, Gallardo approached relationships with a doctor's steady hand. He cultivated them slowly, respectfully, and with consistency. He never made a demand that was too large, never placed someone in unnecessary danger, never allowed emotions to cloud his dealings. Officials found him predictable and reliable, qualities that made him unusually trustworthy in a world built on distrust. Through these relationships, the cartel established a kind of invisible shield around its operations. Governors, police commanders, federal officials, and even certain military figures became part of a quiet web, one held together not only by money but by mutual benefit. Gallardo ensured that payments were delivered fairly and discreetly. He made sure officials felt valued, not used. He offered stability in return for silence, predictability in exchange for cooperation. In return, the cartel received invaluable advantages. They were warned about upcoming raids before they happened. They were given safe passage across key transport routes. They were protected from investigations that might have crippled lesser organizations. Files disappeared, reports were rewritten, witnesses were discouraged from speaking. The cartel became, in many ways, untouchable, not because it was invisible, but because it was integrated so deeply into the very system meant to stop it. But this network went deeper than simple bribery. It extended into legitimate businesses, transport companies, hotels, farms, warehouses, export firms, each one serving as both a mask and a mechanism for moving money and goods. Many business owners didn't even know they were part of the larger machine. They believed they were accepting investments from quiet, respectable partners, never suspecting that the funds originated from one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. Gallardo understood that the key to influence was subtlety. He avoided the flamboyant lifestyle many expected from a man of his stature. He dressed simply, conducted himself professionally, and preferred quiet offices to grand mansions. Meetings often took place in the dim calm of private rooms, no loud music, no armed displays, just soft conversation and gentle negotiation. He cultivated an image of a businessman rather than a criminal, encouraging officials to view him not as a threat, but as someone seeking peaceful cooperation. Internally, his associates marveled at his ability to remain composed even in the face of problems that would have rattled others. If a route was compromised, he called for a quiet solution instead of reacting with anger. If an official hesitated in cooperation, he approached them with patience rather than pressure. His calmness became a form of power, an aura that reassured allies and unsettled enemies. The deeper the cartel's network grew, the more its operations evolved. They built intelligence systems, gathering information on law enforcement activities, political shifts, and rival groups. Informants existed at nearly every level, from low-ranking officers to key administration offices. Some were paid, others cooperated willingly, believing in the stability the cartel provided. The organization became a shadow government operating alongside the official one, not competing with it, but weaving itself into its structure. Over time, the lines between legal authority and criminal influence blurred. Meetings between Gallardo and officials became so routine that they resembled business consultations rather than illicit dealings. Many officials justified their involvement by claiming they were maintaining control over the criminal landscape, preventing violence, and ensuring that operations remained predictable. In reality, they had become part of the system Gallardo quietly commanded. This network also protected the cartel in ways that weren't immediately visible. It shielded the organization from rival traffickers. It allowed disputes to be resolved before they escalated. It ensured that major arrests targeted independent operators rather than cartel members, strengthening the Guadalajara cartel's monopoly. It even influenced judicial outcomes, cases dismissed, sentences reduced, evidence misplaced, investigations redirected. People whispered that Felix Gallardo could make problems vanish with a simple phone call. Not because he threatened anyone, but because he had built relationships so strong that officials acted in his favor without hesitation. His influence flowed silently, like an underground river, steady, powerful, and often unnoticed until the effects were felt downstream. But this power came with a hidden cost. The deeper the cartel's connections became, the more dependent they were on secrecy and balance. Every favor created a debt. Every alliance created an obligation. Every silent handshake tied the cartel's fate more tightly to the political system that protected it. And political landscapes change. Ambitions shift. Loyalties break. For now, though, in the early to mid-1980s, Gallardo's network stood firm. It was his masterpiece, a web of influence that allowed the Guadalajara cartel to operate as both a criminal empire and a business empire, protected not by violence, but by relationships. This invisible architecture would become both the foundation of the cartel's greatest power and the source of its eventual unraveling. But for the moment, it was perfect, calm, calculated, and quietly unstoppable. The rise of the Guadalajara cartel was remarkable on its own, but its true transformation into a global powerhouse came from one strategic move, building a partnership with the Colombian cocaine cartels. It was a relationship born not out of friendship or trust, but out of necessity. Colombia possessed an endless supply of high-quality cocaine and the ambition to flood the United States with it. Mexico, under Gallardo's newly structured federation, controlled the most efficient land routes into the U.S. market. In the early 1980s, these two worlds were destined to collide. And when they did, it was Gallardo, calm, diplomatic, forward-thinking, who turned that collision into an alliance that would reshape the drug trade forever. Before this alliance, the Colombians relied heavily on Caribbean routes, boats, planes, and island chains moving tons of cocaine toward Florida. But the U.S. had begun tightening maritime security. Radar systems improved. Coast Guard patrols intensified. High-risk routes became nearly impossible to sustain consistently. Cocaine shipments were being seized at unprecedented rates, and the Colombians needed a new corridor, one less exposed, less predictable, and less vulnerable. Mexico, with its vast networks and land access, was the obvious solution. But no Colombian wanted to entrust their multi-billion-dollar industry to a fragmented set of Mexican traffickers who constantly fought among themselves. They needed reliability. They needed organization. They needed someone who could guarantee safe passage, not through intimidation, but through structure. That someone was Felix Gallardo. It began quietly, with discreet conversations carried out through intermediaries, each side feeling out the other's intentions. Colombian emissaries, often acting on behalf of the Medellin cartel, sent messages requesting meetings. Gallardo, with his usual caution, agreed, but only under conditions that ensured privacy and safety. The first encounters were held in secluded ranches, luxurious but hidden homes, and neutral locations where all parties felt equally exposed. The Colombians expected arrogance or desperation. Instead, they encountered a man who carried himself like a diplomat, measured tone, steady gaze, meticulous attention to detail. Gallardo did not try to impress them with wealth or threats. He impressed them with predictability, intelligence, and a clear understanding of logistics that rivaled their own. He laid out maps, routes, risk assessments. He explained how the cartel could move hundreds of kilos at a time with minimal exposure. He demonstrated how his growing network of political protection could shield their shipments in ways the Caribbean routes no longer could. The Colombians listened. And for the first time, they saw in Mexico not a chaotic battleground, but an opportunity. What sealed the partnership wasn't just Gallardo's vision, it was his proposal. Instead of charging a flat fee or fighting for a share of Colombian territory, he offered something simple: transportation in exchange for a percentage of the load. A tax. A commission. This single concept redefined the economics of trafficking. For every ton of cocaine that passed through his federation, the cartel would take 30 to 50 as payment. The Colombians would retain ownership and profits from the remaining portion. It was a deal that benefited both sides immensely. The Colombians reduced risk and expanded distribution. The Mexicans suddenly had access to a product with massive profit margins, far exceeding marijuana or heroin. And the Guadalajara cartel shifted from being merely a national organization to an indispensable part of the global cocaine pipeline. As the alliance grew, the logistics evolved into a vast, seamless network. Colombian planes flew into secret airstrips across Sinaloa, Chihuahua, Durango, and Jalisco, landing under the cover of night, guided by coded radio signals and protected by officials who had already been paid. Loads were quickly transferred into trucks disguised as livestock transports, fruit carriers, or government vehicles, then driven north through carefully coordinated routes. The operations were executed with a kind of quiet elegance. Pilots would land, refuel, rest briefly, and depart before dawn. The airstrips themselves, carved into remote fields, ranches, and abandoned properties, were often hidden so well that even local residents never realized what they were passing on their way to town. In some cases, makeshift torches or vehicle headlights lined the dirt runways, forming a soft yellow glow that cut through the darkness as planes glided in. Communication between the two sides also became increasingly sophisticated. Coded messages, encrypted signals, and layers of intermediaries ensured that no single person held too much information. Meetings between high-ranking members were rare and usually hosted in luxurious but guarded villas in Guadalajara or Mexico City. These gatherings were quiet affairs, low voices, controlled emotions, detailed negotiations. A stark contrast to the violent, chaotic image of cartel interactions portrayed decades later. But beneath the calm surface, tension simmered. The Colombians, particularly those aligned with the Medellin cartel, were known for unpredictability and extreme violence. Their reputation preceded them. Gallardo understood this and kept interactions strictly professional. He avoided personal entanglements, refused unnecessary displays of wealth, and maintained boundaries that reduced the risk of misunderstandings. He insisted that all agreements be honored and all disputes handled through dialogue, not force. Meanwhile, within the Guadalajara cartel itself, reactions were mixed. Some welcomed the new profits. Some worried about the dangers of aligning with such powerful foreign cartels. Others believed Mexico should take over the cocaine supply entirely instead of merely serving as transporters. Caro Quintero admired the Colombians but envied their dominance. Don Neto viewed the alliance pragmatically, understanding it was necessary to strengthen their operation. Gallardo, however, saw the bigger picture. He knew that working with Colombia was the fastest way to build the financial foundation needed to dominate Mexico's trafficking landscape. And he understood something deeper: Colombia's violent tendencies made it better to partner with them than oppose them. Over time, the relationship settled into a rhythm of cautious cooperation. Trust never fully existed between the two sides, but predictability did. The Colombians respected Gallardo because he delivered results. Shipments arrived safely. Profits increased. Corruption was handled quietly and efficiently. Losses were minimal. And the Mexicans respected the Colombians because their product opened doors that marijuana could never reach. This alliance reshaped both countries. Colombia focused more on production and internal operations, while Mexico became the bridge, the indispensable middle link connecting suppliers to consumers. The Guadalajara cartel grew immensely wealthy. Entire towns prospered. Businesses expanded. Construction boomed. Money flowed so heavily into certain regions that banks didn't even question the source. But with every shipment that traveled north, with every dollar that flowed back into Mexico, the stakes grew higher. The partnership was successful, but it created dependence, pressure, and expectations. And with expectations came risks. The seeds of conflict had been planted. The need for secrecy intensified. The DEA's attention increased. And within the cartel itself, personalities like Rafael Caro Quintero, fiery, impulsive, hungry for recognition, began to strain against the structured, diplomatic methods Gallardo preferred. Still, in this moment, before the cracks widened, Mexico and Colombia stood aligned, bound not by trust, but by profit. Partners in an illegal empire built on quiet landings, coded messages, and midnight negotiations. For the Guadalajara cartel, this alliance marked the beginning of unprecedented power. For Gallardo, it marked the height of his influence, before the world he built would begin to tremble beneath the weight of its own success. The rise of the Guadalajara cartel was built on alliances and strategy, but its true financial engine, before cocaine fully dominated, came from something far more traditional in Sinaloa's criminal history, marijuana. And no one embodied this operation more profoundly than Rafael Caro Quintero, the young, audacious cultivator whose ambition seemed to stretch as far as the endless green fields he commanded. At the heart of this agricultural empire was a place that would become infamous not because of violence or spectacle, but because of its sheer scale and sophistication, Rancho Buffalo. Its official name, El Buffalo, sounded innocent enough, like a quiet rural ranch. But what lay beyond its boundaries was a marvel of illicit agriculture, a hidden city built on cannabis plants stretching farther than the eye could see. Nestled in the state of Chihuahua, near the town of Jimenez, the ranch spanned thousands of acres. Some estimates would later claim 1,000 hectares, others up to 2,500. The exact number never truly mattered. What mattered was that it was enormous, organized, and unlike anything Mexico, or the United States, had ever encountered. The creation of Rancho Buffalo began with Caro Quintero's relentless drive. He had the kind of ambition that burned hot and wild, the sort that needed to be channeled carefully. Gallardo saw this early on and recognized both the strength and danger in Caro's personality. Where Gallardo was quiet, methodical, patient, Caro was bold, impulsive, and charismatic. He loved risk. He loved success. And he loved proving himself to the older traffickers who still doubted his place in the hierarchy. So when Caro suggested building a plantation so large it would dwarf every other operation in Mexico, most people laughed. Gallardo didn't. He listened. And quietly, he approved the idea, but with conditions. The ranch would need structure. Security. Political cover. Coordination. It could not be a reckless endeavor. It had to operate like a silent factory, not a chaotic farm. Caro took the challenge and created something unprecedented. By day, Rancho Buffalo looked like a patchwork of perfectly aligned rows, marijuana plants taller than grown men, stretching in green waves across the horizon. Workers moved silently through the fields, wearing cloth around their faces to protect themselves from dust and heat. Irrigation systems, innovative for that era, fed water through an intricate network of pipes. Some sources even claimed that agricultural engineers, either knowingly or unknowingly, helped optimize the fields. Fertilizers were imported. Seeds were selected carefully. Quality was monitored like a legal crop. But at night, the ranch transformed into something else, a hub of organized activity guided by low lantern light and whispered instructions. Trucks arrived under the cover of darkness. Bags were filled, weighed, sealed. Bunkhouses lit by dim bulbs housed hundreds of workers, some of whom had been lured with promises of reliable wages, others who had simply been raised in lands where this type of work was as normal as harvesting corn. The air carried a mixture of scents, earth, leaves, wood smoke, and the unmistakable sharpness of dried cannabis. The workers grew accustomed to the rhythm of long days, short nights, and constant vigilance. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, but they did so quietly, avoiding unnecessary attention. Their task was not to intimidate, but to protect an operation that was already producing millions of dollars in product. It was a secret city, a place hidden behind layers of bribed officials and remote geography. And yet, despite its immense size, for a time it remained invisible to the outside world. Gallardo rarely visited the ranch. He preferred to oversee the larger picture, to keep his distance from operations that attracted too much attention. But he monitored everything from afar: production estimates, worker numbers, security reports, distribution schedules. Caro, on the other hand, visited frequently, walking the rows with pride, inspecting plants, boosting morale, and giving orders with the fiery energy that defined him. Even then, Gallardo understood what Caro did not: size was both strength and vulnerability. The larger Rancho Buffalo grew, the more impossible it became to hide. Satellite imagery was still primitive, but human curiosity was not. Whispers circulated through nearby towns about unusual activity, about the sudden presence of outsiders, about the caravans that moved quietly through the region. A plantation of such magnitude couldn't stay invisible forever. Still, the scale of production was unmatched. Tons of marijuana, high quality, carefully cultivated, traveled through the cartel's routes into the United States, generating profits that funded nearly everything the Guadalajara cartel built afterward: bribes, alliances, new routes, safe houses, airstrips. The money from Rancho Buffalo fueled the rise of Mexico's trafficking infrastructure. It allowed Gallardo to negotiate with Colombians from a position of strength. It transformed the cartel from a regional enterprise into a dominant national force. But success carries weight. And the weight of Rancho Buffalo began to strain the delicate balance Gallardo had cultivated so carefully. The DEA started noticing increases in marijuana seizures. Patterns emerged in arrests. Informants whispered about a massive plantation somewhere in northern Mexico. U.S. authorities pressed Mexican officials for answers. And although many within the Mexican government were on the cartel's payroll, not all were willing to risk their careers, or their safety, to protect an operation that was growing so visibly powerful. Tension simmered beneath the surface. Some officials believed the ranch had become too large, too bold. Others feared that U.S. pressure would force Mexico to act. Inside the cartel, Gallardo warned Caro to scale back, to remain discreet, to avoid attracting attention. But Caro, intoxicated by success, believed the ranch was untouchable. He believed the bribes, the power, and the fear the cartel inspired were enough to keep them safe. He was wrong. In November 1984, Mexican soldiers, guided by DEA intelligence, raided Rancho Buffalo in what became one of the largest drug destruction operations in history. Helicopters hovered overhead. Troops poured through the fields. Air was filled with shouting, with dust, with the rustle of thousands of plants being chopped down. Workers scattered, guards vanished into the hills, and Caro's empire of green waves fell in a single day. When news reached the cartel, the shock rippled through every circle. Caro was enraged. Don Neto was concerned. And Gallardo reacted the only way he knew how, with stillness. He understood that this was not just the destruction of crops. It was a warning. A shift. A sign that their operations were no longer invisible. But tonight, in the calm of storytelling, Rancho Buffalo remains frozen in time, not in its downfall, but in its life, an endless green horizon, workers moving like shadows across the fields, water glistening under the sun, the hum of activity rising and falling like a heartbeat. It was a marvel of illegal agriculture, a symbol of ambition, a testament to organization, and a foreshadowing of the storm to come. For beneath those quiet waves of green, the seeds of the cartel's eventual collapse were already beginning to sprout. The story of the Guadalajara cartel, its power, its wealth, its illusion of invincibility, would never be complete without the man who would unknowingly become its greatest threat. A man who did not carry guns, did not command armies, did not seek violence or fame. A man whose dedication to his work and quiet persistence would set off a chain of events that reshaped the history of Mexican trafficking forever. His name was Enrique Kiki Camarena. Long before his disappearance sent shockwaves across two nations, Camarena was simply a man doing his job with an unwavering sense of duty. Born in Mexico and raised in California, he straddled both worlds with ease. He understood the culture, the language, the families who crossed the border chasing opportunity. His childhood taught him the value of hard work, discipline, and the belief that one person could make a difference, values he carried into adulthood with a calm, determined sincerity. Before joining the DEA, Camarena served as a firefighter, a Marine, and a police officer. These experiences strengthened not only his resolve, but also his ability to stay composed under pressure. When he eventually entered the world of drug enforcement, he carried with him a sense of purpose that went beyond arrests and investigations. He wanted to dismantle the systems hurting communities on both sides of the border. He wanted to protect the youth he saw falling into addiction. He wanted to give families hope that someone was fighting for them. But his work in Mexico would place him directly in the shadow of men far more powerful and dangerous than he could have imagined. Camarena arrived in Guadalajara in 1981, a time when the cartel was reaching the height of its strength. He was assigned to the U.S. consulate, officially serving as a DEA agent but functioning more like an intelligence gatherer, tasked with understanding the complex web of traffickers, politicians, businessmen, and police that made up the criminal hierarchy. He entered this world quietly, without theatrics, without the confrontational attitude many officers adopted. Where others demanded information, Camarena earned it. He spoke to people with genuine interest. He listened rather than lectured. His demeanor, calm, friendly, and deeply human, encouraged trust from informants who would never have approached more aggressive agents. He walked markets, restaurants, and busy streets with the casual ease of a local, blending into the daily rhythms of Guadalajara without drawing unwanted attention. Yet beneath this approachable exterior was a mind sharply attuned to the patterns forming around him. He noticed unusual shipments passing through rural roads. He tracked movements of known traffickers. He listened to rumors whispered in cantinas and safe houses. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture began forming, a picture of an organization far more structured and powerful than anything the DEA had encountered before. The Guadalajara cartel, with its political protection and coordinated operations, was unlike the smaller, chaotic groups the DEA had been accustomed to targeting. It was disciplined, well-financed. And, thanks to Gallardo, nearly invisible. For most agents, trying to infiltrate such a machine would have felt impossible. But not for Camarena. His persistence was quiet but unstoppable. He followed leads others ignored. He connected details others dismissed. He worked late nights reviewing reports, conducting interviews, and verifying information with meticulous care. His investigation shifted sharply when whispers began circulating about a massive marijuana plantation hidden somewhere in Chihuahua, a plantation capable of supplying entire regions of the United States. The scale sounded unbelievable at first, larger than anything the DEA had ever encountered. But Camarena didn't dismiss it. He felt something in his gut, a sense that this rumor, this shadow of a plantation, held the key to understanding the cartel's true power. He began digging deeper, interviewing laborers, truck drivers, and anyone with knowledge of remote agricultural operations. The more he learned, the more convinced he became. A single plantation, if large enough, could explain the cartel's sudden surge in influence. It could explain their alliances. It could explain their growing financial power. What Camarena didn't know was that his steps were being watched. The cartel's intelligence network was vast, and officials sympathetic to the organization quietly warned them whenever a DEA agent came too close. Camarena's name began circulating in conversations among traffickers, who initially brushed off his persistence. But as he got closer to the truth, closer to Rancho Buffalo, they began to pay attention. Still, Camarena continued his work calmly, never acting recklessly. He shared his findings with the U.S. government, urging them to pressure Mexican authorities into raiding the plantation. Eventually, in late 1984, the raid on Rancho Buffalo confirmed everything he had suspected. It was a monumental victory for the DEA, and a devastating blow to the cartel's finances. And suddenly, without intending to, without even seeking the spotlight, Camarena had become the cartel's greatest threat. Yet he didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He simply moved on to the next lead with the same quiet diligence that had defined his entire career. He believed the work was far from over. He believed the cartel could be dismantled if the right threads were pulled. But the cartel believed something else, that Camarena had gone too far. His persistence had exposed vulnerabilities they didn't even realize existed. His dedication had pierced through layers of protection they thought were impenetrable. His investigation had cost them millions, and worse, it had embarrassed them. At the same time, Gallardo watched from the background, analyzing the situation with the same steady composure he applied to everything. He understood the power of perception. He understood that losing control, even slightly, invited danger from rivals, from politicians, from foreign agencies. And Camarena's success had created precisely that kind of danger. But this rising tension didn't appear in explosive confrontations. It showed up quietly, in subtle shifts. Conversations ended abruptly when his name came up. Meetings grew tense. Leaders whispered concerns about leaks. Camarena felt the weight of these changes. He sensed shadows following him, sensed the atmosphere tightening around him. Yet he continued his work, guided by a sense of duty he refused to abandon. The stage was set, not for confrontation, but for a tragic entanglement of two men's paths. One man seeking truth. One man seeking control. Both moving steadily toward a collision that would alter history. But for now, in this moment of the story, they remained distant figures circling the same storm, Camarena in his search for answers, and Gallardo observing quietly from the shadows, calculating how far the agent's investigation might spread, and what it might reveal next. The disappearance of Enrique Kiki Camarena marks the turning point in the story of the Guadalajara cartel, the moment when quiet tensions erupted into consequences that could no longer be contained. Up until this chapter, the cartel had flourished under a delicate balance of diplomacy, political protection, and strategic restraint. But with the destruction of Rancho Buffalo and the relentless persistence of Camarena's investigation, that balance began to collapse. What followed was not a sudden explosion, but a tightening of pressure, slow, quiet, inevitable, like the gradual closing of a trap around an organization that had believed itself untouchable. In early 1985, Guadalajara felt different. The city still bustled with life, vendors shouting in markets, taxis weaving through traffic, musicians filling plazas with the warm tones of guitars, but beneath the surface, a sense of unease was spreading through the cartel's inner circles. Meetings were no longer relaxed gatherings of confident men planning shipments. They were tense, guarded, filled with whispered concerns about leaks, informants, and the attention of U.S. agencies. Camarena had become a name that carried weight. Not the weight of fear, but the weight of an unpredictable threat. He wasn't a violent man. He never stormed into rooms or kicked down doors. His power came from his persistence. His refusal to stop. His ability to connect threads others overlooked. And in the eyes of the cartel, that made him dangerous in a way guns and badges could never replicate. Reports reached the cartel that the DEA was pushing harder. That U.S. officials were angry. That investigations were slowly creeping toward the high-level political connections that had shielded the cartel for years. And in the middle of every piece of intelligence, every rumor, every whisper, one name kept appearing: Camarena. Gallardo, Don Neto, and Caro Quintero began meeting more frequently, often late at night in quiet homes lit by dim lamps. Cigarette smoke filled the air. Maps were laid out. Voices were hushed. The problem was not just that an agent had discovered a major plantation. The problem was that he had proven the cartel was vulnerable. If the DEA raided Rancho Buffalo once, they could do it again. If one plantation could be found, others could too. And if Camarena kept pulling at the threads, the entire federation could unravel. Most of the cartel viewed the situation through anger. Caro Quintero especially was furious. He believed the raid was a personal insult, a humiliation, a strike at his pride. In his frustration, he pushed for drastic action. He wanted answers. He wanted retribution. He wanted to find every person responsible for exposing the ranch. But Gallardo approached the situation differently. He understood the broader implications. He knew that the Americans would not tolerate further losses. He knew politicians in Mexico were growing nervous. He knew that their carefully built alliances could crack under pressure. In his quiet, analytical way, he tried to maintain control, to calm his partners, to prevent impulsive decisions. Yet even Gallardo could feel the walls closing in. Meanwhile, Camarena continued his work unaware of how close the danger had crept. He noticed suspicious cars in his rearview mirror. He sensed he was being watched. Friends warned him to take precautions. But he believed in his mission and trusted that his role within the U.S. consulate provided enough protection. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't hide. He walked the streets of Guadalajara as he always had, calmly, openly, believing in the principles that guided his life. It was this calm routine that made him vulnerable. On February 7, 1985, Camarena left the U.S. consulate for what seemed like an ordinary day. He walked toward his car, unaware that shadows were closing in around him. A group of armed men approached. They moved with precision, acting quickly and with practiced coordination. Before he had time to react, he was forced into a waiting vehicle. The car sped away. The street returned to its usual rhythm within seconds, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everything had changed. When Camarena failed to appear for a meeting, concern turned to worry. When hours passed, worry turned to fear. And when his car was found abandoned, the U.S. consulate transformed into a crisis center almost instantly. Phones rang non-stop. Agents were deployed. Officials contacted both Mexican and U.S. authorities. Everyone understood the gravity of the situation. A U.S. DEA agent had vanished in a country where the most powerful criminal organization held immense influence. In Washington, panic set in. This wasn't just a missing person case. It was a potential international incident. The DEA, outraged and fearful, mobilized one of the largest investigative operations in its history, Operation Leyenda. Agents were sent to Mexico. Pressure was placed on the Mexican government. Diplomats demanded answers. Investigators worked day and night, following every lead, every rumor, every whisper. Inside the cartel, panic of a different nature spread. Gallardo maintained his composed demeanor, but he understood the severity of what had happened. An American agent disappearing on Mexican soil would provoke a reaction unlike anything Mexico had ever seen. This was no longer about protecting routes or hiding plantations. This was about the survival of the Federation itself. Caro Quintero spiraled into paranoia. He feared betrayal. He feared punishment. He feared the full weight of both governments crashing down on him. His unpredictability became a liability. Some within the cartel believed he had acted without thinking. Others whispered that his impulsiveness would bring them all down. Mexican authorities found themselves trapped between political loyalty, financial dependency on cartel money, and pressure from the United States that could not be ignored. Arrests began. Raids intensified. Officials who once proudly cooperated with the cartel suddenly grew quiet, distancing themselves from an organization whose protection no longer felt certain. The balance Gallardo spent years creating, this delicate web of alliances, bribes, and political favors, began to unravel thread by thread. Meetings with officials became strained. Promises were rescinded. Allies stopped answering calls. Even longtime supporters sensed danger and moved away, fearing they would be caught in the storm that was now gathering. Every layer of protection the cartel once relied upon was peeling away. What made this moment so catastrophic was not just the disappearance itself, it was what it represented. It was evidence that the cartel had lost control. Evidence that internal discipline had fractured. Evidence that the very structure Gallardo had built was beginning to collapse under pressure it had never been designed to withstand. For the first time, the Guadalajara cartel was no longer operating from a position of strength. It was reacting. Struggling. Fighting to maintain an image of stability in a world that suddenly felt unstable. And at the center of this unfolding disaster, two men stood on opposite sides of a widening chasm, a DEA agent who believed in justice. A cartel leader who believed in order. Both caught in consequences they could no longer control. The disappearance of Camarena was not just a scandal, it was the spark that ignited the collapse of a criminal empire. The ground beneath everyone's feet was beginning to shift. And nothing would ever be the same again. The downfall of a criminal empire almost never begins with the guns of rivals or the force of authorities. It begins with something quieter, something subtle, whispers, doubts, shifting loyalties, and the slow erosion of trust. After the disappearance of Kiki Camarena, that erosion began to seep through every corner of the Guadalajara cartel. What had once been a perfectly balanced federation, held steady by Felix Gallardo's calm leadership, now felt fragile, unstable, and tense. The cartel had thrived on silence and order, but in the months that followed, silence became suspicion and order gave way to fear. Inside the organization, men who once carried themselves with confidence began lowering their voices. Meetings were no longer smooth, controlled discussions, they were tense gatherings where every sentence was weighed, every glance analyzed for hidden meaning. The cartel had always benefited from a rare unity, unusual in the criminal underworld, but unity depends on one thing above all, trust. And now, trust was dissolving like fog in the morning sun. The disappearance of Camarena was a line that could not be crossed without consequences. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. And everyone wondered who would be blamed, who would be sacrificed, who would be exposed. The raid on Rancho Buffalo had been a financial loss. Camarena's disappearance was a political catastrophe. It placed the entire federation under a spotlight that burned too brightly, illuminating cracks that had always been there but had never mattered, until now. Rumors began circulating almost immediately. Some claimed that Caro Quintero had acted impulsively, driven by rage and humiliation. Others whispered that the order came from higher up, perhaps even from those within the cartel who felt threatened by Camarena's investigations. No one knew the full truth, and no one dared to ask. Silence, once a tool for maintaining peace, now felt like a weapon pointed inward. Caro Quintero's paranoia grew dangerously fast. He became consumed by fear, fear of betrayal, fear of retribution, fear of losing control. He questioned loyalties. He demanded answers that no one could safely give. Associates who had once admired his boldness now avoided him, sensing the volatility in his moods. He stopped trusting even those closest to him, believing that anyone could be working with the authorities. Don Neto, usually a stabilizing force, found himself caught between his loyalty to the organization and his awareness of the growing danger. He tried to calm tempers, to restore the old sense of order, but even he could not deny the tension tightening around them. He knew that the DEA's pressure was intensifying. He knew that Mexican authorities were preparing to distance themselves. And he knew that Gallardo was facing a problem bigger than anything the cartel had encountered before. As for Gallardo himself, he felt the shift before anyone else. He sensed it in the way officials spoke to him, more cautiously, with less warmth. He sensed it in the way bribes were accepted but not acknowledged. And he sensed it most clearly in the way his partners were beginning to act, not as a unified council, but as isolated leaders protecting their own interests. For a man who built his empire on order, structure, and mutual benefit, watching that foundation erode was more devastating than any external threat. Gallardo understood human nature. He understood that fear could unravel years of stability in a matter of days. He tried to restore calm. He held private meetings, reassured anxious associates, and insisted that the Federation could survive if everyone remained disciplined. But discipline was no longer enough. The cartel was facing pressure from forces that could not be negotiated with. The DEA wanted justice. The U.S. government wanted answers. Mexican authorities wanted to avoid international scandal. Every layer of protection the cartel had depended on, political allies, police commanders, local officials, now felt shaky. These officials had taken money from the cartel for years, but money meant little when the world's most powerful government was demanding accountability. As external pressure mounted, internal fear grew sharper. The cartel's lieutenants began to distance themselves from decisions they once supported wholeheartedly. Some minimized their involvement in conversations. Others avoided meetings entirely. Everyone was calculating how to survive what they sensed was coming: arrests, betrayals, and a collapse that could sweep them all away. Territorial disputes, once resolved through calm negotiation, reappeared with renewed ferocity. Groups that had accepted Gallardo's peace through structure philosophy now questioned whether unity still served their interests. Some began reinforcing their own territories independently, preparing for the possibility of fragmentation. Others quietly reached out to rival groups outside the Federation, exploring alliances that would have been unthinkable months earlier. In safe houses and ranches across Mexico, traffickers sat awake at night, listening to the distant sounds of dogs barking or trucks passing, fearing each noise could signal a raid, an arrest, or the arrival of men sent by paranoid partners. Even those who had enjoyed the Federation's protection for years began packing cash, documents, and essentials, ready to flee at a moment's notice. The cartels. Once structured routes, warehouses, and airstrips, symbols of control, now felt like liabilities. And while all this unfolded, the U.S. investigation grew larger by the day. Operation Leyenda deployed more agents, more pressure, more coordination with Mexican authorities than any previous case. Informants were questioned. Former allies were interrogated. Politicians were scrutinized. Connections that had been secure for years began to weaken. The cartel could no longer rely on its influence to stop investigations from moving forward. Gallardo, sensing the storm approaching, met with his closest confidants in increasingly secretive gatherings. The calm, deliberate tone that once guided his decision-making was now overshadowed by a sense of urgency he tried but failed to hide. He instructed partners to lay low, to reduce operations, to avoid drawing attention. But it was already too late. The storm had entered their world, and no amount of caution could push it back. As the Federation unraveled, one thing became painfully clear: the Guadalajara cartel had never been built to survive a crisis of this magnitude. It had been constructed on the belief that political protection, unity, and diplomacy would always be enough. But now, trapped between the wrath of two governments and the instability within their own ranks, these pillars were collapsing. The once solid alliances were now fractures. The once reliable officials were now liabilities. The once disciplined organization was now a web of fear and suspicion. In these final moments of unity, the cartel members still pretended everything could return to normal. But deep inside, they all knew the truth: a house built on shadows cannot withstand the light. And the light was coming, fast, relentless, and unforgiving. The fall of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo did not arrive with the dramatic chaos that often marks the end of powerful criminal figures. There were no blazing shootouts, no desperate escapes through crowded streets, no final standoffs beneath roaring helicopter blades. Instead, his capture unfolded in the same quiet, calculated manner that had defined much of his life, calm, understated, almost eerily serene. But beneath that stillness lay the undeniable truth: the empire he had built over years of delicate negotiations and careful alliances was collapsing, and there was nothing left to hold it together. By 1989, the Guadalajara cartel was no longer the meticulously organized federation Gallardo once envisioned. It had fractured under the weight of Camarena's disappearance, U.S. pressure, and internal distrust. Caro Quintero and Don Neto had already been captured, each taken in operations that shook the criminal world. Their arrest sent a clear message: the government, pushed relentlessly by Washington, would not rest until every key figure was brought down. Gallardo knew this better than anyone. He had spent the last few years watching the walls close in with unyielding precision. Officials who once returned his calls immediately were suddenly unavailable. Meetings with political allies grew shorter, colder, more distant. Hints of betrayal floated in every conversation, and the familiar sense of control he relied on began slipping through his fingers like loose sand. Yet even as pressure increased, he maintained his dignity. He avoided panic. He didn't flee Mexico or attempt a violent stand. Instead, he quietly relocated to Guadalajara, moving into a modest home that offered nothing of the luxury or extravagance people expected from a cartel leader. The home was a far cry from a criminal fortress: no high walls, no sprawling estates, no armed guards conspicuously posted. It looked like the residence of a retired businessman, not the headquarters of the most influential trafficker of his era. From within that quiet home, he continued conducting business in the only way he knew how: calmly, rationally, with a strategic mind that refused to dull even as his circumstances darkened. But every passing day brought new signs that the end was near. More arrests. More raids. More allies disappearing into the shadows or switching their loyalties. The network he once built with such precision had become unrecognizable. The morning of his arrest, April 8, 1989, began like any other: soft light filtering through windows, the hum of a city waking, roosters crowing in distant courtyards. There was no forewarning, no sleepless night before the operation. Gallardo woke, dressed neatly, and prepared for the day, unaware that it would be the last morning he would spend as a free man. Before sunrise, Mexican federal agents, backed quietly by U.S. intelligence, surrounded his neighborhood. There were no sirens, no loudspeakers, no dramatic announcements. The operation was executed with restraint, a reflection of the respect, or perhaps caution, with which authorities approached a man known for his intelligence and influence. Cars rolled in softly. Doors opened silently. Agents positioned themselves strategically, communicating in murmurs that dissolved into the morning air. When they approached the house, they did not break the door down in a show of dominance. They knocked, firmly, unmistakably, but not violently. Moments passed. Inside, footsteps approached. And then Felix Gallardo himself opened the door. He did not look surprised. He did not shout or resist. He simply observed the men in front of him with a calmness that unsettled even seasoned officers. It was as if he had been expecting this moment, not necessarily today, but eventually. He stood tall, composed, dressed neatly in a pressed shirt, his hair brushed back. His demeanor was that of a businessman receiving unexpected visitors, not a cartel leader about to be taken into custody. The agents informed him of the arrest. He listened without interruption, his expression steady, almost contemplative. There were no accusations from him, no denials, no pleas. Only acceptance. He nodded and allowed them to enter, offering no resistance as they placed handcuffs around his wrists. His movements were fluid, his posture straight, dignified, almost peaceful. That quiet moment marked the symbolic death of the Guadalajara cartel. The agents escorted him out of the home. The street outside was empty, still bathed in early morning silence. A few neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their hearts caught between shock and inevitability. For years, many had whispered about Gallardo's real identity, but the calmness of his daily routine made it easy to forget the scope of his power. Now, seeing him walk out with guards on each side, they witnessed the end of an era. As Gallardo stepped into the waiting vehicle, he took one final look at the street around him, the simple houses, the distant sounds of the city waking up, the pale glow of dawn. It was a world he had operated within but never truly belonged to. And in that brief, quiet moment, perhaps he understood that his life had always been leading to this stillness. Power, influence, alliances, wealth, none of it could stand against the forces now arrayed against him. He was transported away without drama. No reporters shouted questions. No helicopters hovered overhead. His arrest was purposeful and efficient, carried out with the same quiet precision he had once used to build his empire. But unlike his rise, his fall was irreversible. In the days that followed, newspapers across Mexico and the United States printed headlines declaring that El Padrino had been captured. Politicians congratulated themselves. The DEA celebrated. Ordinary citizens wondered what his arrest would mean for the future of Mexico's criminal landscape. Some believed it would bring peace. Others feared it would unleash more violence as younger, more brutal leaders fought to fill the vacuum. Inside prison walls, Gallardo was processed, photographed, and assigned a cell. He accepted each step without visible frustration. He did not protest conditions. He did not challenge the system he once navigated effortlessly. He simply observed, adjusted, and continued as he always had, quietly. For him, freedom had ended the same way it began, in silence. But the effects of his capture rippled far beyond those quiet prison corridors. His arrest shattered the last remnants of unity within the cartel. Old alliances splintered instantly. Territories were divided among ambitious lieutenants. Rivalries flared. And in the chaos that followed, the next generation of cartels, Tijuana, Sinaloa, Juarez, began to form. Gallardo, sitting quietly behind bars, may not have realized it at that moment, but his capture was not only the end of an empire. It was the beginning of a new and more violent era in Mexico's criminal history. Yet none of that chaos was visible on the morning he was taken away. That morning belonged to stillness, to a quiet, defeated acknowledgement that even the most powerful men eventually face the consequences of the worlds they create. And for the man once called El Padrino, the quiet fall had finally arrived. The fall of most criminal empires ends when their leader is captured. But for Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the story did not end on the day he was placed in handcuffs. In many ways, it was only transforming. His body was confined behind the stone walls of a prison, but his influence, cultivated over decades of diplomacy, negotiation, and quiet strategy, remained alive. The world outside still moved according to plans he had shaped, alliances he had forged, and structures he had built. And in the months following his arrest, something extraordinary happened. He reshaped the entire map of Mexico's drug trade from inside his cell. To understand the magnitude of what occurred next, one must understand the power vacuum that Gallardo's capture created. The Guadalajara cartel, once unified under a single strategic mind, had splintered. Its lieutenants were scattered across states and safe houses, each one anxious to fortify their own position. The organization could no longer be held together by meetings in quiet ranches or calm negotiations in hidden offices. But despite the chaos, the principles that had defined Gallardo's leadership were still respected: order, structure, predictability. Even from prison, he remained the only man capable of preventing a full-scale war among the traffickers who once sat beside him at the Federation table. In the weeks after his arrest, whispers began circulating among imprisoned traffickers and outside operatives. Men visited him under the guise of family or legal consultations. Low-ranking officers were bribed to deliver messages. Attorneys traveled between cells and safe houses delivering carefully coded instructions. It was not difficult for Gallardo to communicate. Mexico's prison system was porous, and influence flowed like water through its cracks. But what he communicated was what surprised everyone. He called for division, not unity. He proposed that the Guadalajara cartel should be formally dismantled. That the remaining territories should be divided among leaders who could manage them independently. That instead of one massive federation, Mexico should transition into a network of regional cartels, each responsible for a specific area of operation. There would be no single boss, no single structure, no central command. The empire would split into pieces like a mirror shattering into clean, deliberate fragments. And his reasoning was brutally logical. The federation had become too large, too exposed. It drew too much attention from the United States, too much pressure from the Mexican government, and too much fear from political allies who had once protected them. If the empire remained united, it would be destroyed piece by piece. But if it were divided, if each region operated independently, the pressure would scatter. The U.S. could not pursue everyone at once. Mexican authorities would prioritize targets selectively. And local leaders would have incentive to maintain stability rather than ignite conflict. A federation could fall. A network could survive. And so, with the calm precision that had defined his entire career, Gallardo began redrawing Mexico's criminal landscape. He proposed that the Arellano Felix brothers, young, ambitious, ruthless, should take control of the Tijuana corridor, the most valuable crossing point along the U.S. border. He believed their aggression, combined with their connections to powerful families in Baja California, would make them formidable guardians of that region. He entrusted the Sinaloa corridor, including cities like Culiacan and surrounding regions, to men he had known since his days under Aviles, traffickers like Héctor El Güero Palma, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. They were younger, less refined, more unpredictable, but they were disciplined and loyal. He sensed potential in their hunger, saw in them the seeds of a future empire that could operate without drawing the kind of attention the old federation had received. The Juárez corridor, another vital passageway, was offered to Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the quiet, calculating trafficker who would one day become El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. Gallardo recognized in Amado a reflection of himself, a strategist, a negotiator, a man who valued order over chaos. Amado's rise had been steady and careful, and Gallardo believed he could maintain stability along the border. Other regions, Sonora, Chihuahua, parts of Jalisco, were assigned to leaders whose strengths matched local needs. Some were given control because of their families. Others because of their alliances. Still others simply because they were the least likely to ignite unnecessary wars. This distribution of territories became known as the Plaza System. It was Gallardo's final masterpiece, a way to prevent war by offering each leader a piece of the empire they could control independently. Each plaza had its own routes, its own local officials, its own lieutenants. They would all still operate within the broader Mexican underworld, but without the centralized authority that had once made the Guadalajara cartel a singular target. To those who visited him in prison, he explained it simply: if we stay united, we all fall. If we divide, we survive. But survival, of course, did not mean peace. While Gallardo believed the division would prevent a catastrophic collapse, he underestimated the ambitions of the men he was empowering. The Arellano Felix brothers ran Tijuana with unchecked brutality. Chapo Guzmán began expanding with aggressive confidence. Amado Carrillo Fuentes modernized trafficking through fleets of aircraft. And as each leader built their own empire, quiet rivalries simmered, waiting to erupt into the violent conflicts that would define the next decades of cartel history. Still, it was Gallardo's blueprint that guided them. In the early months of his imprisonment, Gallardo worked tirelessly, sending instructions through visitors, letters, and coded messages. Guards turned a blind eye. Officials allowed meetings. His influence extended not only beyond the prison walls, but into the boardrooms and safe houses of every major trafficker who had once answered to him. The plaza system was finalized. Roles were assigned. Boundaries were drawn. And when the reorganization was complete, something rare happened. For a short period, there was peace. The fragmentation of the Guadalajara cartel functioned exactly as Gallardo intended. Mexico's criminal world became decentralized. Each new cartel focused on strengthening its own region rather than fighting for national dominance. The U.S., despite its enormous pressure, struggled to adapt. The Mexican government found itself negotiating with multiple groups instead of one. The structure had changed, but the business continued, with even more efficiency and caution than before. But while the outside world moved forward, Gallardo himself retreated deeper into prison life. His control, though still present, grew more distant with time. He could influence decisions, but not shape them fully. He could advise, but not command. Slowly, the generation he had empowered began making their own choices, choices that would later ignite wars he had feared from the beginning. Yet in this moment, this chapter of transition, Gallardo's influence was still undeniable. He had done something no imprisoned leader before or after him had ever achieved. He reshaped a nation's criminal structure from behind bars. He created a new era, one defined not by unity, but by division. Not by a single empire, but by multiple kingdoms. His men called him a strategist. Officials called him a manipulator. Historians would later call him the architect of modern cartel Mexico. But for Gallardo himself, sitting alone in a quiet cell, his thoughts were simpler. He had built. He had united. And now he had divided, hoping that through division, some semblance of order might survive. Though he could not predict the future, he knew one truth: his decisions inside that prison would echo through Mexico for generations. The division of the Guadalajara cartel was meant to restore balance, to prevent a catastrophic collapse, to keep the peace Gallardo had fought so carefully to build. But like many plans created in moments of crisis, it functioned only in the calm before a storm. What Gallardo did not fully grasp, perhaps because he still believed in diplomacy, or because he overestimated the restraint of the men he empowered, was that he was creating something entirely new. Not a federation, not a cooperation, but an ecosystem of rival kingdoms. And once these kingdoms found their footing, the quiet order he hoped to preserve began to unravel into something far more volatile. In the early days of the division, the plan seemed to work. Each new leader returned to their own territory, focusing on rebuilding routes, securing protection, and handling their own distribution networks. For a brief moment, there was a sense of relief, an illusion that perhaps the violence could be contained, that the embarrassment of the Camarena affair would fade, that the blows to the old federation would heal with time. But beneath that thin veneer of stability, deeper forces were already shifting, forces that would reshape the landscape far more dramatically than even Gallardo had imagined. The younger traffickers, ambitious, hungry, and shaped by a different era, did not share the diplomatic restraint that defined Gallardo's generation. They respected him, yes, but they did not think like him. They had grown up watching the drug trade evolve into a billion-dollar empire. They had learned that power came not only from alliances and negotiations, but from violence, intimidation, and total territorial control. The plaza system had given them freedom, but it had also given them opportunity to expand, to dominate, to challenge old boundaries. And they took it. In Tijuana, the Arellano Felix brothers, Benjamin, Ramon, and Eduardo, ran their territory with iron fists and unapologetic brutality. Their empire grew quickly, their methods far harsher than those of their predecessors. Tijuana became both a gateway and a battleground, controlled by fear, fortified by hundreds of armed enforcers, each more ruthless than the last. They did not simply guard their plaza, they ruled it like monarchs. In Sinaloa, the seeds of a new power were beginning to sprout. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, still young and underestimated, saw the division not as a chance for peace, but as a launching pad. He was bold, impatient, constantly seeking expansion. Héctor Palma, his closest ally, shared that hunger. Ismael El Mayo Zambada preferred diplomacy and longevity, but even he understood that survival in this new era required a stronger hold over territory. Together, they planted the roots of what would become the Sinaloa Cartel, an organization more sophisticated and expansive than the Guadalajara Federation had ever been. Farther east, in Ciudad Juárez, Amado Carrillo Fuentes built an empire hidden behind calm professionalism. Unlike the Arellano Felix brothers or Chapo, Amado was quiet, strategic, composed, and ambitious in a way that resembled Gallardo himself. But he innovated in ways no one else imagined. He created fleets of airplanes capable of transporting tons of cocaine in a single operation. Under his guidance, the Juárez cartel became one of the most efficient trafficking organizations in the world. What Gallardo had hoped to avoid, ambition colliding with ambition, was now inevitable. The diversity of leadership styles, the hunger for dominance, and the sheer scale of profits created an environment where peace could not last. Each cartel wanted more. More routes. More crossings. More control. And in a world where territory meant billions of dollars, no leader was willing to step back. But the unraveling did not happen through immediate warfare. It began slowly, almost invisibly, as the cracks in the system widened. Corruption, once organized and consistent under Gallardo's guidance, became more chaotic. Each cartel bribed its own officials, creating competing loyalties within police forces and political offices. One official might accept money from Tijuana while also serving Sinaloa, each favor pulling him in opposing directions. This made the system unstable and unpredictable, exactly the opposite of what Gallardo had designed. Violence, once rare under the old federation, now grew in shadows. A dispute between traffickers in Sonora. A disagreement over fees in Baja California. A betrayal along the Juárez corridor. These incidents were small at first, isolated, contained by mutual interest in avoiding all-out war. But as the cartels grew stronger, the stakes grew higher. The arrival of younger, more aggressive enforcers, trained not in negotiation but in warfare, fueled the flames. These men had grown up idolizing the violent myths of traffickers rather than the diplomacy of Gallardo. They preferred quick dominance over strategic patience. They brought with them trucks filled with high-caliber weapons, armored vehicles, and eventually, military-grade equipment smuggled across borders. They turned plazas into fortresses and lieutenants into warlords. And the public began to feel the shift. Where Gallardo's federation operated quietly, avoiding unnecessary attention, the new cartels left visible marks. Shootouts on highways. Bodies displayed as warnings. Messages painted on walls. Terrified communities caught between rival factions. For the first time, the people of Mexico saw trafficking not as a hidden industry operating in the shadows, but as an open conflict unfolding in their streets. Through it all, Gallardo watched from prison. Visitors told him stories. Newspapers referenced the rising violence. Radio broadcasts described territorial clashes. And in the stillness of his cell, he realized the truth he had tried so hard to avoid: the unity he had built was gone. The diplomacy he valued had vanished. The generation he nurtured had evolved beyond his control. His division plan had achieved its goal, preventing the immediate collapse of the drug trade, but it had also created unintended consequences. By giving each leader autonomy, he had allowed them to grow without restraint. By protecting them from war in the short term, he had accidentally planted the seeds of future conflicts far larger than anything the old Federation faced. He had created survival. But they had created ambition. And ambition, unchecked, always leads to conflict. The alliances he once shaped with quiet negotiation were now replaced by cell phone calls ordering hits. Safe houses became command centers. Border crossings became war zones. And the cartels, no longer bound by a single vision, prepared for a future defined not by cooperation, but by rivalry. Gallardo had envisioned a peaceful division. What emerged instead was the blueprint for decades of bloodshed. As he grew older in his prison cell, listening to the echoes of a world that no longer needed him, he understood something with painful clarity: you can divide an empire, but you cannot divide human ambition. And in the empire he left behind, that ambition was already beginning to burn. By the time the 1990s unfolded, the name Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo had already become a ghostly echo of a different era, an era of quiet negotiations, unified power, and criminal diplomacy that seemed almost unreal compared to the chaos now spreading across Mexico. He was no longer El Padrino, the architect of an unprecedented cartel federation. He was inmate number 2580, living behind concrete walls, steel bars, and the thick silence of a life reduced to routine. And yet, even within the confines of prison, the shadow of his former influence lingered, soft, fading, but undeniably present. Life in prison did not break Gallardo in the dramatic way many expected. There were no outbursts, no rebellions, no fiery denials of guilt. Instead, he adapted with the same calm, methodical demeanor that had defined his rise. He woke early, kept to himself, and spent hours in quiet reflection. He observed his surroundings with a detached clarity, as though watching the world from behind an invisible curtain. At first, guards and fellow inmates treated him with caution. This was the man who once held the Mexican drug trade in the palm of his hand. The man who had built political alliances that stretched through the highest levels of government. The man whose whispers had once shaped the decisions of powerful traffickers and ambitious politicians. But inside the prison walls, power operated differently. Respect wasn't earned through money or influence, it was earned through behavior, consistency, and survival. Gallardo offered no resistance to this new reality. He did not attempt to recreate his old hierarchy. He did not buy loyalty. He did not issue threats. If anything, he withdrew into himself, becoming a figure of quiet solitude. His calmness unsettled some inmates. Others interpreted it as wisdom. But to Gallardo, it was simply the only path forward. Letters became his primary connection to the outside world. At first, they were frequent: updates from lawyers, messages from old associates, coded reports about the new cartels rising from the ruins of his old federation. Visitors came with hushed updates about Tijuana, Sinaloa, and Juarez. They described the violence escalating between the Arellano Felix brothers and Chapo Guzman. They spoke of Amado Carrillo's growing fleet of aircraft. They mentioned the rising chaos along border towns once governed quietly through negotiation. But with each update, Gallardo's reactions grew muted. The empire he had helped build was no longer his. His successors were not students following a teacher's blueprint, they were warlords rewriting the map with bullets and ambition. The world outside was becoming louder, faster, and more brutal. And in the stillness of his cell, he realized how far the criminal landscape had drifted from the principles he once believed in. He aged faster in prison than he ever had outside. Stress, confinement, and isolation pulled at him in ways power never had. His health deteriorated. Sleep became restless. Physical ailments began to shape his days more than politics or strategy ever could. The man who once walked confidently into political offices now shuffled slowly across the prison courtyard, leaning on walls for support when no one was watching. As months turned into years, and years into decades, the outside world continued evolving without him. Television sets in the common areas flickered with images of cartel wars, shootouts on freeways, seized shipments, mass graves uncovered in remote fields. News anchors spoke of Los Zetas, La Familia Michoacana, and new splinter groups with names Gallardo had never heard of. Each report felt like a reminder that the era he had shaped was gone. His legacy had mutated into something unrecognizable, transformed by the ambitions of men he once believed he could guide. Visitors became fewer. Associates who once sought his counsel found new mentors. Politicians who once owed him favors pretended not to know his name. Even the guards stopped treating him like a figure of Myth. To them, he became just another prisoner, older, quieter, friendlier each day. His family remained the one constant connection. Children, grandchildren, and siblings visited when they could, bringing small comforts, books, letters, soft-spoken reassurances that he was not forgotten. These were the moments that softened his expression, that pulled him temporarily out of the fog of regret and memory. He cherished these visits, though he rarely showed emotion. He would listen more than he spoke, offering gentle advice, asking about their health, and avoiding conversations about the world he once controlled. Over time, Gallardo moved through different prisons, some harsher, some quieter, all equally suffocating. In one facility, he tended a small patch of garden, caring for plants with a tenderness that contrasted starkly with the empire he once commanded. In another, he often sat alone beneath a tree, staring at distant hills as though trying to remember how the air once felt on the ranches of Sinaloa. Isolation did not bring clarity, not fully. But it did bring reflection. He thought about the choices that had shaped his life. The desire to bring order to chaos. The decision to unite traffickers instead of letting them destroy each other. The meetings in dimly lit rooms. The alliances forged and broken. The promises made. The consequences that spiraled beyond his control. He wondered whether he had built something that was doomed from the start. Whether unity among men driven by ambition and fear was ever truly possible. Whether there was a moment, one moment, when he could have taken a different path and changed everything. But in the quiet of prison, regret rarely shouts. It whispers. Some nights, as he lay on the hard cot staring at the ceiling, he could almost feel the weight of past decisions pressing down on him, not violently, but heavily, like a slow, sinking realization that the world he once tried to organize had become more dangerous because of the foundation he created. As the years stretched on, the man once known as El Padrino faded into obscurity. His influence outside weakened. Younger generations grew up without knowing his name. Inside prison walls, he became an older man with failing health, more defined by silence than power. But occasionally, rarely, someone would whisper his story. A guard who heard rumors from older colleagues. An inmate who remembered tales from Sinaloa. A reporter seeking historical context. And in those whisperings, he existed still, not as a monster, not as a hero, but as a man whose ambition changed the course of history. The empire he built was gone. The men he mentored had risen and fallen. The alliances he shaped had dissolved. The world had moved on. And Gallardo, frail, soft-spoken, and alone, became what remains when legends crumble, a memory. A cautionary tale. A quiet man living out his final years in the shadow of an empire that no longer needed him. In the stillness of his cell, with the distant echo of footsteps down the corridor, he finally understood the truth he had spent his life avoiding: power fades. Influence erodes. And even the most carefully constructed empires eventually outgrow their creators. Public perception has a way of reshaping a man long after he loses control over his own story. With time, facts blur into rumors, and rumors settle into legend. And for Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the discreet strategist who built Mexico's first criminal federation, this transformation began the moment he stepped into the shadows of imprisonment. The world outside no longer saw the man, it saw the myth. In the years that followed his fall, El Padrino became less a name and more a symbol. Media headlines described him as the Godfather of modern trafficking, the mastermind behind an empire, the architect of a system that outlived him. The dramatic version of his life, shaped by books, documentaries, and later by television portrayals, captured global fascination. People imagined a cold, fearsome ruler seated in dimly lit rooms, controlling territories with a single command. But those who knew him personally remembered a different man. Not a tyrant, not a loud intimidator, but a quiet strategist. A man who preferred listening over speaking, negotiation over violence, structure over chaos. Someone who believed leadership meant understanding people, not overpowering them. The real Gallardo was far removed from the theatrical myths that grew around him. Inside prison walls, he lived simply. No throne, no guards trembling at his presence, just an aging man with softening features and fading strength. Yet outside, the myth painted him as an omnipresent force whose influence continued to steer the drug trade from behind bars. Meanwhile, in reality, the criminal world had moved on without him, reshaped by leaders who acted with far more brutality than he ever tolerated. Still, his myth grew. Cartel members of the next generation spoke his name with awe, sometimes reverence. They attributed to him abilities he never possessed, predicting wars, controlling governments, pulling strings through unseen channels. They spoke of him as a master chess player whose strategies continued to echo. To them, he was not a man, he was the blueprint. Historians and journalists added their own layers. Some viewed him as a criminal genius who understood the future better than his peers. Others argued he was simply a product of a corrupt era, a man who rode the momentum of political connections. Television dramatizations amplified both sides, turning him into a precisely calculated mix of intelligence, mystery, and danger. These portrayals thrilled audiences but simplified the real person beneath the myth. Meanwhile, the man at the center of all this, the aging figure in a small prison cell, struggled to reconcile these portrayals with the memories he carried. Occasionally, he would hear guards mention a documentary or an article about him. Sometimes, a visitor would bring a newspaper clipping or a piece of gossip from the outside. Gallardo rarely responded. Yet internally, he seemed almost detached from the legend being built in his name. In later interviews, when he was already frail and nearly blind, he denied being the Godfather. His voice, quiet, trembling, revealed none of the sharp authority the world associated with him. Whether his denials reflected humility, regret, or simply exhaustion, no one could say for certain. But in those moments, it was clear that the myth and the man had drifted so far apart they barely resembled each other. And still, the myth persisted. Perhaps because people need larger-than-life figures to understand a world as complex as Mexico's underworld. Perhaps because stories about masterminds and shadows are easier than the messy truths of corruption, poverty, and political failure. Or perhaps because Gallardo's calm, strategic mind truly did leave a permanent imprint on the criminal world, even if he never intended for the violence that followed. In the end, the myth of Felix Gallardo became louder than his voice, stronger than his presence, and more enduring than his influence. And somewhere between the legend and the truth, the real man remained, quiet, fading, and human. After the fall of the Guadalajara cartel, Mexico did not experience the peace many hoped for. Instead, the country entered a new chapter shaped by fragmentation and shifting power. Gallardo's decision to divide the territories had been meant to protect the organization from collapse, but once the plazas became independent, ambition overtook restraint. The Tijuana cartel, led by the Arellano Felix brothers, governed their territory through intimidation and ruthless enforcement. Their methods were loud and violent, very different from Gallardo's quiet diplomacy. Meanwhile, the Juarez cartel under Amado Carrillo Fuentes grew through innovation. Using a fleet of aircraft, he transformed trafficking routes into efficient international pipelines, earning the title, Lord of the Skies. In Sinaloa, a quieter but more enduring power emerged. Joaquin, El Chapo, Guzman, Hector Palma, and Ismael, El Mayo, Zambada operated with flexibility and patience, slowly expanding across key regions. Their cartel would eventually dominate the landscape in ways the old federation never imagined. As these cartels grew stronger, corruption intensified. Officials who once answered to a single organization were now pressured by several. Local police forces fractured under competing loyalties. Violence escalated from isolated confrontations to full-scale turf wars, leaving border towns and entire communities caught between rising armies. The United States also shifted its approach, targeting multiple cartels instead of one. This pressure, combined with internal rivalries, made the criminal landscape even more unstable. From prison, Gallardo heard about the violence unfolding outside. He listened as visitors described conflicts he had once tried to prevent. The federation he built had dissolved, and in its place rose an unpredictable world governed by leaders far more aggressive than he ever intended. His blueprint had survived, but its consequences had grown far beyond anything he envisioned. In his final years, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo lived in a world far removed from the power he once held. Age, illness, and confinement shaped his days more than strategy or influence ever did. The man once known as El Padrino now moved slowly through the quiet routines of prison life, his steps unsteady, his vision fading, his body weakened by time. From his small cell, he observed the world from a distance, a world where the empire he built had splintered into rivalries, wars, and new generations of traffickers who no longer remembered his rules or restraint. News of violence, cartel battles, and political corruption reached him like distant echoes. The order he once tried to impose had dissolved into instability. Visitors grew fewer over the years. Old allies disappeared. Journalists stopped asking questions. Only family remained, offering gentle words and brief moments of warmth. To younger inmates, he was not a legend, just an old man with trembling hands. As he grew older, Gallardo reflected quietly on his past. He remembered the early days in Sinaloa, the ambition to bring organization to a chaotic world, and the decisions that shaped an entire generation of trafficking. Whether he felt regret or simply acceptance remained unclear, his emotions were subdued, softened by age and solitude. The outside world continued to define his legacy. Some saw him as a mastermind, others as the architect of an era that led to unprecedented violence. But in the quiet of his final years, he was neither hero nor villain, just a man contemplating the consequences of a life lived in the shadows. When asked how he wished to be remembered, his answer was simple: as someone who tried to bring order. His story ended not with power, but with quiet reflection, a reminder that even the greatest empires fade, and every legacy is shaped by both intention and consequence.